and thought, before I had done, of a mocking tale of or a gibe, to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I, but live where motley is worn, all changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. W.B. Yeats. John Maxwell was a British imperialist if there ever was one, and much like many other British aristocrats at the time, they believed the Irish were savage compared to them. So this strike at England he viewed as something that had to be dealt with in the most serious and brutal manner. So he began to hold military tribunals for the rising's leaders. But this wasn't the true atrocities. The British had been, during the Rising, ordering executions of civilians, people they believed to be Fenians, but they were lining them up in the streets and gunning them down, to make an example of the Irish rebels for daring to raise a hand to the strength of the British Empire. So when the British finally accepted Pierce's surrender, the civilians actually cheered because it meant the British would no longer abuse them. But once the soldiers got to the barracks, the true abuse began. Soldiers began to spit in the rebels' water and force them to drink it, along with continuously beating the Fenians. An infamous event happened. Before Maxwell arrested the leaders, the British officers dragged many of the leaders into the center of the barracks yard. They stripped them down naked and beat them in front of their followers in an attempt to humiliate them. Most of the volunteers tried their best not to look on. The only person, though, that was missing from all of this was none other than James Connolly. Connolly, because of his wound, was taken to Dublin Castle where he was being treated for the wound. But this wasn't the only reason he was there. James Connolly, of all the leaders, was the most popular. Not like a celebrity, but sort of. He was beloved by tens of thousands of Irish citizens as a Union leader and defender of the working people. So the British knew that he was the only leader that they had to be extremely careful of what they did with him. His ankle had been shattered and become gangrenous due to low medical supplies in the GPO, and he was slowly dying of blood poisoning. Now, for someone like Lord Winborne, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a man who lived in Ireland knew that Connolly was a vital figure in keeping the peace. But Winborne had lost most of his power to Maxwell, who was in command of Ireland that was still under martial law. So the trials began. Now, tribunals are supposed to be done by men not related to the actions in question. But Maxwell picked himself and several other officers who personally led troops through the Rising, which is completely against military ethics, but Maxwell wanted the trials done quickly, so he brought each leader in and demanded their judgment. He found them all guilty, including Connolly, who wasn't even able to walk. The men were all brought to Kilmainham Gaol, a large Victorian-era prison in the southwest of Dublin, to await execution, except Connolly. Among them was the entire military council, minus Connolly, the woman leader of the attack on St. Stephen's Green, Constance Marzievik, also Pierce's little brother Willie, whom Pierce did not know surrendered himself, and also a man who would later rise to prominence, Eamon de Valera. On May 3rd, Pierce, MacDonough, and Clark were marched into the prison yard of the gaol and shot by firing squad. The next group would be on May 4th. Joseph Plunkett, who had been married the night before to his fiancée, Willie Pierce, Pierce's younger brother, Edward Daly, and Michael O'Hanrahan, both leaders of their own respect of units in Dublin. On May 5th, only one execution by firing squad was for John McBride, another leader of a cell of the Irish Volunteers. On May 8th, it would be Eamon Kant, Michael Mallon, Sean Houston, and Con Colbert. Con short for Cornelius. At this point, the public was becoming very wary and turned away from the English, finding the British response too brutal. On May 12th, Sean McDermott was executed. But so was Connolly. Now, Wimborne had tried to stop the execution of Conley. He had told Maxwell of the influence that Conley held. But again, Maxwell did not care. This finally forced Wimborne to finally contact London. But on May 12, 1916, British soldiers carried Conley on a stretcher into the courtyard of Kilmainham. They tied him to a chair, and the priest, a Catholic priest, asked him, "Will you say a prayer for these men?" His response, "I will say a prayer for all men who do their duty according to their light." They then fired on him, tied to a chair. He'd be the final leader executed. The British government, after being contacted on Maxwell's actions, was furious. The War Ministry ordered Maxwell to stand down and to suspend any further executions. Maxwell agreed and then moved the bodies of the dead leaders to Arbor Hill Prison. Originally, the soldiers dumped the bodies in a mass grave and laid quicklime on their bodies to disintegrate the corpses. But when Ireland later became a republic, the new government made the grave a national memorial, where the men's names are lined around the grave. But following the executions, it served to do the opposite. In fact, it turned most of the population sympathetic to the Irish Republican cause. The British, now seeing the pressure from the Irish public, decided it would be easier to remove all the rebels in general from Ireland. So it was decided they would be shipped from Ireland to Wales, and most of them would be placed in Frognach internment camp. While here, many of the Irish began to look to new leaders. This is when we see men like Michael Collins, Eamon de Valera, W.T. Cosgrove, just to name a few. But there's one man that we've yet to discuss, the man who brokered the deal between the Irish and the Imperial German government. The humanitarian Roger Casement, who, though his arrest was discovered to be a homosexual. Now, being a homosexual in this era was a crime in itself, but Casement's attorneys attempted to use his homosexuality to his advantage. The way they did this was by stating that Casement was insane, hence the homosexuality. So when he was committing the treason, he was in a state of insanity. But Casement refused to enter that plea. Not only was he proud of his actions in the liberation of Ireland, but he refused to recognize his sexuality as insane. And it was natural to him. So once he was brought to trial and found guilty, many people renowned actually lobbied for an appeal to save his life. These people included Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, W.B. Yeats, and George Bernard Shaw, all very famous writers. However, his two colleagues from the Congo, Joseph Conrad, the writer of Heart of Darkness, and his assistant, Herbert Ward, would not forgive him. This was because both of their sons were serving in the First World War, and they believed this was such a treachery that while they were dying in Europe, he did this. The United States of America, who facilitated the deals between the Irish Republicans and the German Imperial government, also demanded clemency. But again, we were not the country that the United States is today. So the British government refused. Casement then requested he be buried in County Antrim, back in Ireland, right by the water. But he was hanged on August 3rd, 1916, at Pentonville Prison. The two Catholic priests who attended him before and after his death respected and admired the man, saying, "A saint. We should be praying to him instead of for him." Now, Casement's request would not be honored. Instead, he was buried in the back of the Pentonville prison. His remains would not be returned to Ireland until 1965, when British Prime Minister Harold Wilson officially returned the remains to the Republic of Ireland. His state funeral will be held at Arbor Hill, near the graves of Casement's allies. He would be laid to rest at Glasnevin Cemetery, along with other Irish Republican leaders. His funeral will be attended by Eamon de Valera and another 30,000 veterans who served throughout the war Casement was able to ignite for freedom of their home. Now, as for the men who were sent to Wales, they were not there very long. They would be released in December of 1916. The new British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, commonly known as the Welshmen, ironically, closed the camp, citing its cruel and unsafe conditions for the prisoners. The cruelty of Frontenac and the British reaction to the rebellion will be what watered the seed of rebellion. Next, we will begin the retaliation and also the true beginning of the Irish War of Independence and the introduction to the villains of this tale, the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. Thanks for watching. We will continue this series. It's been a lot of fun, especially because this is my own heritage. I know this was supposed to go up yesterday. I did unfortunately have a personal emergency I had to deal with. I'm okay, I hope. But I will be better next week. We'll have our full week doc next week, including this series. So thank you so much. Please like, share, and comment. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and join our growing community. Thanks so much for all your support, and we'll see you in the next one.